Hi, and now we're going to enter into the last chapter, and it's also a difficult chapter. It's gendered power and violence. My special note here is the material in this chapter is especially sensitive and potentially polarizing of women and men in class here. When I say in class, I mean online, of course. And in reviewing this chapter, it's extremely important to channel your viewing as a productive and objective means as you can. Now, having said this, I respect everyone has had different experiences regarding power and violence. And as such, I have minimized emotionally charged graphics, so you won't see as many images in this video. I understand if anyone would prefer to review the textbook and not watch the video, I understand. Instead of watching this video, however, I do my best to be respectful and present this material as a means of shedding light on a sensitive issue. Alright, isolated incidences of violence may occur because of individual pathology. However, individual ideologies cannot explain why violence is pervasive. Now, it's important, and we're going to consider this throughout, but individual pathology would be more like a biological underlying cause. That doesn't explain the pervasiveness. That's a very hyper-individualized experience and very limited. And so the whole point around it's our ideology can't explain all of this, it's more pervasive. So when we consider the social construction of gendered violence, widespread violence, particularly against groups, does not reflect views and values. So let's begin to look at gendered power and violence. There are many faces of gendered violence, and as I mentioned in the introduction, individual pathology won't explain the widespread violence against a particular group. This section is very heavy in categories, so be prepared and have your notes ready. Let's get started. Gendered violence includes physical, verbal, emotional, sexual, and visual brutality that is inflicted disproportionately or exclusively on members of one sex. Gender intimidation exists when people, because of their sex, gender, or sexual orientation, are treated in ways that make them feel vulnerable and unsafe. This is also called street harassment, a common form of sexualized remarks made in public spaces. LGBTQ people or people who do not conform to gender norms are also a subject to gender intimidation in the form of humiliating, disrespecting, or imposing violence. Sexual harassment is unwelcome verbal and nonverbal behavior of a sexual nature that links academic or professional standing or success to sexual favors that interfere with work or learning. Women are the predominant targets. Now, it says predominant. It doesn't say only. This certainly does occur as when men can be victims as well. The quid pro quo harassment, interesting title given that's what's been going on in the U.S. as far as a news item. It is the actual or threatened use of professional or academic rewards or punishments to gain sexual compliance from a subordinate or a student. Now, this form of harassment depends on power differences. The person seeking the sexual favors must have some kind of power over the other person. Hostile environment harassment is unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature that interferes with a person's ability to perform a job or to gain an education. It's also conduct that creates a hostile, intimidating, or offensive work condition because of the sexualized conduct. This form of harassment is often between peers. A hostile environment grows out of a pattern of behavior. A single action is unlikely to meet the legal standard. It's a pattern over time. Now, sexual assault is a sexual activity that occurs without informed consent of at least one of the persons involved. One type of sexual assault is rape, and for many years, marital rape was not recognized as a crime. And in 1982 in Canada, rape is a marital relationship became illegal. and that was only in 1982. Trans people are particularly vulnerable to assault. 1 in 2 are sexually abused or assaulted in their lifetimes. The definition of sexual assault includes the concept of informed consent. Informed consent is only given by an adult who is of typical mental abilities, who is not under the influence of alcohol or drug, and who is not coerced. Children cannot give informed, nor can inmates who are coerced. Sexual assault has been a major problem on college campuses, the US and Canada alike. One reason for the prevalence of the existence of a rape is the existence of a rape culture, defined as common attitudes, beliefs, and practices that ignore, excuse, or even encourage or normalize sexual violence. Now, many people, including college students, believe rape myths, such as rape is usually perpetrated by someone who is strange to the victim. An estimated 90% of rape victims know their assailant. Claiming that a woman deserved to be raped because of her behavior or dress is blaming the victim. Holding the harmed person responsible for the harm that others have inflicted. Fewer studies have focused on the perpetrators of sexual assault and rape. One study found 6% of men reported they had raped or had attempted to rape someone they knew. Of those men, approximately 2/3 were serial offenders. Sexual assault is not confined to civilian context. It's a serious problem in the military. The Department of Defense, this is in the US, surveys reveal that 90% of female cadets experience a form of sexism, including assault. In 2008, the United Nations designated rape as a weapon of war. Rape has, throughout history, been used as a means of ethnic cleansing, humiliation, and intimidation. Frequently, rape in these contexts go entirely unpunished and is often inflicted on very young children. Intimate partner violence includes physical, mental, emotional, verbal, or economic power used by one partner against the other partner in a romantic relationship. Intimate partner violence is experienced and perpetrated by both sexes and by all sexual orientations. 25% of U.S. women have been violently attacked by a husband or a boyfriend. Bisexual women are far more likely to be beaten, stalked, or sexually assaulted by an intimate partner. At least 30% of women worldwide have been victims of intimate partner violence. Control is a key issue for many abusers who want to control their partners' appearance, behavior, relationships, and their lives. Violence between intimates typically involves a cyclical pattern. There's a mounting tension, explosion in violence, remorse, an apology, and then there's a honeymoon, and then it gets repeated, typically. You'll see a breakout box in your text. It might be useful to run through that. Now, both women and men can be abusers, but there are general differences in the types of violence committed by men and women. Women tend to verbally abuse, slap, or shove a partner. Men are more likely to use their bodies and weapons to commit assault. Abusive men's assault are typically more violent and tend to overestimate how common such a behavior is, and they underestimate the amount of harm that they inflict. Men tend to use violence to enhance self-esteem, win respect, and exert control. Women are more likely than men to use relational aggression in romance relationships, hurting a partner by manipulating social relationships. Now, stalking, it's a form of intimate partner violence, and it's repeated pursuit that is uninvited and unwanted that makes the target of the pursuit concerned for his or her safety. This next section It's not something that occurs as frequently in North America, although it has been, and it's an issue, of course, but it happens in other parts of the world where it's a part of a cultural norm which has been changing, and that is genital surgery. It is also known as genital mutilation and genital cutting. This practice continues to be practiced in some countries where more than 200 million women and girls have been cut. This includes the practice of Zafsuna, a clitorectomy, infibulation, and male circumcision. Genital surgery is rooted in cultural traditions which can only change when members of the culture resist them, such as Chinese citizens fighting against the practice of foot binding. Gender-based murder. And I'll mention two facts here. When both sexes are given proper care, females will generally outnumber males. And two, however, in many countries today, men outnumber women. And the reason for this is gender-based murder. Women being killed before or after birth. Reproductive technologies can selectively abort female fetuses and select sex prior to an in vitro fertilization. Others reduce the number of women through female infanticide. That's the active or passive killing of female children. Femicide is the killing of women, and it takes the form of adult women who simply disappear. Dowry deaths, bride burnings. Femicide is not confined to developing nations. Consider the statistics on intimate partner violence in the United States and Canada, or the mass killings of women. Montreal Massacre, for example, on December 6, 1989. This spawned the White Ribbon Campaign. Also consider the number of missing Indigenous women in Canada. Reproductive violence is coerced or discriminatory infringement on the reproductive rights. This includes forced or exploitation that prohibits someone from having the free will over the decision to become a parent and parent the existing children. In the United States, this took the form of eugenics and state-funded programs that forcibly sterilized women involuntarily. Racism has long effective reproductive regulations, with programs offering poor minority women free birth control but denied them other health care services. Commercial surrogacy disproportionately affects poor women. In this practice, wealthy women who are unable to conceive or carry a child pay poor women to carry children for them. The power dynamic is problematic here, with many women making the decision to become surrogates based on their own poverty and the need for money. Now, there is also cultural foundations for gendered violence, and individual pathologies alone can explain pervasive gendered violence. The normalization of violence in the media. Gendered violence is frequent, varied in the media, on films, TV, and in music, and in video games. Including in this is, of course, pornography, and pornography is sexually explicit material that favorably depicts subordinates, degradation, and non-consensual sexual behavior. Distinctly, erotica depicts consensual activities desired by and pleasurable to all parties. Now, one study found men who viewed mainstream pornography were more likely to say that they would commit rape than men who did not. Now, of course, these sorts of researches are specific and not necessarily generalized to all aspects of research, but it certainly draws out some conclusions that maybe need additional research in as well. The normalization of violence in institutions, and we'll look at a few of institutions, and we'll begin with school. In the U.S., there were 55 colleges and universities subject to investigation because they may or may have mishandled investigations of sexual assault. Here in Canada, we have our own mishandlings of investigations, and many students say that they are not taken seriously when reporting rape or other sexual assaults. Colleges and universities want to preserve their reputation the White House established a special task force in 2014, which provided information and resources on preventing and responding to sexual assault on campuses. This happened here in Canada as well. Georgian has focused more on student safety with postings and apps for security purposes. And you can see that just in behind me here. Another institution would be family, and in families where violence exists, children may grow up assuming that violence is a part of marriage. Families may encourage women to stay with violent men for economic security because, well, it's her duty, or for the sake of the children, or immigrant women or women of color may be especially vulnerable to pressures not to report intimate partner violence. If we look at law enforcement, the current legal system does not offer sufficient safeguards for victims. Some law enforcement officials and judges give greater priority to maintaining a two-parent family than the safety of survivors. Laws governing restraining orders need to be strengthened so people can get protection before tragedies happen. If we consider language sometimes reflects and sustains cultural acceptance of gender violence by obscuring the seriousness of the issue. Passive language that obscures moral responsibility for violence but not indicating the abuser fosters permissive attitudes towards abuse. Labels like domestic abuse, sex scandal, they tend to minimize the reality of what is really happening. Neither one is good. So if we were to resist gendered violence, what do we do and where do we go from here? Well, there's some personal efforts that we can do to reduce gendered violence. The most basic personal choice is to decide you will not engage in or tolerate violence in your relationships. Should be easy to decide. If it were, we'd all be doing it though. Refuse to be a silent bystander. Speak or act to prevent violence. You can join groups on campus, or you can or in your community, write or call to the media. Teach your children that nobody has the right to touch them in a sexual way. Some other social efforts to reduce gendered violence. These efforts can include supporting educational and social service institutes, voting for laws that will reduce violence and punish those who commit it, and working with others to educate communities and create resources for victims of violence. The NFL announced in 2014 it would take a more serious stand against violence in the league. If you've been watching some of the news about the NFL, you would see that maybe that hasn't all happened. It's great to talk about it, it's great to have intentions, it's another thing to act on it. Taking a voice. Direct power is the ability to make others do what they would not do on their own. Agenda setting can be efforts to shape the public's agenda or to encourage in an agenda setting in a professional or social relationships. Voice is communicating with others and engaging in everyday acts of principled resistance. One way to do this is to adopt the treacherous identity, remember from chapter 4, or to challenge sexist attitudes and practices in everyday life. And I do this myself. It's not always easy, but it gets easier. When you hear a sexist joke, call it out. If some of your friends, male friends, are speaking in a way that you know not to be an appropriate way to speak about women generally, speak up. You'll be surprised. There will be some people who will respect you greater for having done so because they feel the same way and they're just going along. And you'll have some people say you're weak and it's not appropriate. Well, I would tend to differ. I respect that in a person, in particular in a man, far greater than any guy who thinks that it's okay to abuse or attack a woman or anybody. All right? For what it's worth. Okay, I know that's a tough chapter. I tried to go through it relatively quickly, and I know you do have an option to read the chapter in the textbook if it would be better. And it's unfortunate that it's the last chapter in the textbook, and this is the way we end. However, I hope that you've learned something from this course, you've gained something to think about and maybe challenge yourself, and I hope going forward you will put every effort into being the best version of yourself that you can be. Bye everybody, and good luck in your future. Bye now.